All right, everyone. It is 11 o'clock, so I will go ahead and get us started this morning. Good morning. I'm Taylor Post, Swiftland's office manager, and I would like to welcome you all to today's webinar, Introduction to Library of Congress Classification, and today's presenter, Dr. Karen Snow. Dr. Karen Snow is an associate professor and PhD program director in the School of Information Studies at Dominican University in River Forest, Illinois. She previously worked as a cataloger in the Rare Book Room, University Archives, and the Technical Services Departments at the University of North Texas. She currently teaches beginning and advanced cataloging courses at Dominican University, both face-to-face and online. Please welcome Dr. Karen Snow and enjoy her webinar this morning. Karen?
It's capturing this. Okay. I'm not seeing any comments. So I'll just assume that you all can hear me okay. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, so I'm going to, okay, now you can, okay, so Sharon, thank you. So everyone can hear my voice okay. All right. Okay, so because I can turn up the volume a little bit more. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. As Taylor said, hi, I'm Karen Snow, and I'll be your presenter here today of this webinar on Library of Congress classification. And as she said, I teach full-time at Dominican University in Illinois, and if you do have any questions after this webinar, then please feel free to email me. I really don't mind. You emailing me if you need any clarification on anything we talked about or have any questions. Okay, so today these are our learning outcomes. This is an introduction to Library of Congress classification, so I am making no assumptions on your knowledge of classification or cataloging, quite frankly. So if this may seem a little basic for some of you all who are working with Library of Congress, just bear with me. I'm going to be building to more, complicated concepts in LCC, with the next webinar as well, where we're going to actually be building Library of Congress classification call numbers. So if you haven't signed up for that one, I think it's the end of August is the second webinar. But for today, we're just going to focus on, just the basics of the importance of classification in libraries. And then also, I want you, by the end of this webinar, to be able to identify the parts of a Library of Congress call number. Okay, my voice is buzzing, is what I'm hearing. Hold on one second. Okay, so is it still buzzing? I'm hoping, okay, I hear an echo after every word. Okay, so it's better. Okay, so I think that maybe I was just turning up the microphone. That may be why it's buzzing. Okay. All right, thank you for letting me know. I appreciate that. I'm watching the chat always, so if there are any issues, please let me know. And Gretchen, I don't really know what is going on with the echo. When I heard Taylor talk, I didn't hear any echo, so I'm not quite sure what's going on with that, but you may want to kind of chat with Taylor about that. So okay, so then also, oh, good, Gretchen. So it just seems to just stopped. That's that's awesome. That's awesome. It's good to get these technical issues, cleared up at the very beginning. So that's good. Okay. All right, so learning outcomes, right, we're going to learn about main entry cutters, how to create them, how to locate Library of Congress classification online. I'll just say LCC for short. It's just easier to say that. And also just be able to kind of interpret entries within the schedules, okay? So just kind of starting off with the basics, and like I said, then we'll build from there. Okay, so first of all, whoops, sorry, it's like cut off. My slides. I forget that Adobe Connect does this. It kind of messes with my slides, so I apologize. You will be getting these slides after the webinar, by the way. So you will have your very own copy. So they don't look like with this stuff cut off. So I apologize for this, but Okay, so essentially, library classification. Okay, what is this? What is library classification specifically? Because classification generally, that's kind of a much larger topic that we're not getting into here today. For our purposes, it's the process of fitting a resource into a predetermined hierarchy of concepts, and then assigning notation that represents then I think that it's supposed to be supposed to say here the resources topic. Sorry, I don't know why it's cutting off here, but it's supposed to represent the resources topic. Typically, within a library setting, that notation that's assigned to represent a concept will be either numeric, okay, so numbers, or alphanumeric, or like a number letter combination. And it does kind of double duty here. So it not only brings together or collocates works on the same topic, but it provides a physical or virtual address for a resource, okay, which makes it a little different than like using subject headings, for example, okay? So because of that, we can typically only assign one classification number to a resource because we need it to be in like a physical spot, even though technically you can assign, you know, for a virtual resource, a digital resource, a classification number as well. Okay, so the most popular classification systems that we'll see in the United States, at least, are the Dewey Decimal Classification, or DDC for short, which contains only numbers in the class number, and then also perhaps a decimal point if needed for that specificity. It's primarily used by school and public libraries, but it can be used really by any library, but that's primarily used by school and public libraries. And then the Library of Congress classification, which is what we'll look at today, contains numbers and letters in the class number, and is used primarily by academic libraries, but once again, it's not exclusively for academic libraries. So whenever you see that capital letter or letters, right, because there can be multiple capital letters at the beginning of the notation for LCC, that will be usually Library of Congress classification and not Dewey. Okay, so I'll also be talking a lot about classification numbers at the beginning, and then we'll kind of ease into talking about a larger call number. These are two different things. The classification number is part of a larger call number. So for example, in Library of Congress classification, if we use the notation D811.5, that's the classification number, and then there's other things within the call number that we need to then organize further, right, the resource on the shelf. Typically the second part will be either one cutter or cutters, so we'll talk more about what cutter numbers are here shortly, I promise, and then a publication date. Okay, so we'll talk about each part of these call numbers, each part of the call number. It's not uncommon for libraries to kind of use their own call numbering system without class numbers, or just kind of using them very loosely, and that's fine, right? Especially if it's not a, you know, a really large collection. It makes sense to, especially for like fiction, to have things organized, you know, here's the fiction section, or even into like genres, for example, so mystery, science fiction, etc. And then just kind of use whatever, a way to then organize by author. And that's fine. I mean, there's nothing inherently wrong with that. It's just the problem is that for larger collections, you're going to end up with a lot of the same call number. So, which is not great if you have a collection where you need people to find things pretty quickly and efficiently. So that's why I think, for especially for academic libraries with much larger collections, it's helpful to have the LCC call number as opposed to kind of their homegrown one there. Because, I mean, in these, like I said, sometimes these local call numbers, especially for fiction, are helpful because, like in Dewey and LCC, if you want to organize by just like fiction and then genre, etc., because it's not organized by genre. Anyway. All right, so as I mentioned before, there is a difference between classification and subject headings. Obviously, with subject headings, we use terms, right, to represent concepts, as opposed to classification, which traditionally has been, either numbers or number-letter combinations. Though you see it a little bit more often with, like, BISAC, that book industry standard where they actually do use terms as for their classification, but that's, well, it's a separate issue. But with classification, though, like I said, since we can really, for the purposes of shelving, want to use just one classification number per item, so people can find it on the shelf, you would assign one, but with subject headings, you can assign multiple, right? You can have multiple subject headings in the record. And that's, like I said, that's just kind of, they have different purposes. So the class number should be based upon the first subject heading in the record, typically. That's what Library of Congress does. So if you don't, that's fine, but that's kind of the best practice is to do that. Because that should be, the first subject in the subject heading in the record should be the primary subject of the work. Okay. Here is just an outline of the Library of Congress classification system on the screen. We're starting with Class A, General Works, all the way to Class Z, our favorite classification number, Library Science, right? So, but as you say, we have most of the alphabet letters here, not all of them. As you can see, there's no Class O or Class I, for example. But most of them are here. And each of the classification letters that you see, they don't necessarily align with the actual topic. Okay, so it's just Class M is music by happenstance, but yeah, otherwise, we can have just a single letter at the beginning of our class number, or like I said, sometimes you'll see multiple letters, but they all begin with a capital, at least one capital letter at the beginning. Okay, so just a few other things just about, history and background of Library of Congress classification. It has been around for quite some time. It's just driving me bonkers that it's cutting off my text here. Anyway, so it was first developed in the early 20th century, so it's been around for over 100 years now. Library of Congress classification by the Library of Congress. Obviously, it's their classification scheme. That they started developing after Melville Dewey said that they could not adapt his decimal classification. So what they done is they took built on another classification scheme designed by Charles Cutter, who will make another appearance here soon, used his classification system to build their own. But it was never intended as an embodiment of a pervasive philosophical system for classifying knowledge, but designed and developed for purely practical purposes, the effective organization of the library's own collection. Okay, so, and that's something that's important to keep in mind. As we talk about Library of Congress classification, as you use it, you look at the classification system, is that, like I said, it was geared towards Library of Congress's collection. So it's not always going to be great for classifying every single collection out there. LC used to be not quite as good about allowing others to kind of dictate how the Library of Congress, like the additions, etc., to the classification system, but they're much more open to that now, okay, to suggestions outside of Library of Congress to adapt the system, but it's still, once again, their classification system, so we have to keep that in mind, so they make the decisions. Just like Library of Congress subject headings, LCC is based on literary warrant. Okay, that means that Library of Congress uses primarily published literature, which is whatever has been published works, to determine what concepts to include within the LCC schedules. Okay, so they don't just include anything and everything you can think of in the kind of the organization of the knowledge out there. They primarily use the published literature to guide them on what to include. It is hierarchical, so it moves from broader to narrower categories, just like kind of Library of Congress subject heading to an extent. Okay. Now, how do we access Library of Congress classification? It's no longer published in print volumes, so we do have to access it online. I'm going to be using Classification Web for the examples in this webinar. but it does require a subscription. So does anyone here, so we have 22 participants, so does anyone here, do you know if you have Classification Web, like a subscription for your institution to Classification Web? Does anyone know? If you don't, that's totally fine too, but I'm just curious. Okay, so, okay, a whole lot of no's. Okay. Okay. And that's totally fine. Okay, so you know, you can, if you want to try it out, they do provide, Library of Congress provides a 30-day trial that if you go to classweb.org, I believe there's a link there that you can do that. But yeah, it is subscription based. Okay, so it does cost money. So, but it depends on how many concurrent users you have. And that's how that it just kind of depends on how many concurrent users you have. That, sorry, I can't speak. The cost is dependent upon the number of concurrent users you have. So if you only want, you know, a subscription for like one concurrent user, then it's going to be a lot less money than what it would be for more people, so on there. But anyway, I'm just going to use that for like the screenshots for examples, but keep in mind that there is a free LCC in PDFs. Okay, it's the same information that you see in Classification Web. I promise, it's the same information. It may not be as updated as frequently because it's just a bunch of PDFs. And it's also, the PDFs lack the functionality in the classification. So Classification Web is like, you know, a website where you can navigate and search and browse, where the PDFs are, like I said, PDFs. So they're kind of more flat. So as an example, here I just kind of picked out one part of the Library of Congress classification schedules, this HB, you know, 99.7 and so forth. At the top, this is Classification Web, where you can see how these entries, they're the same. You can see kind of the terms there on the right-hand side associated with the class numbers on the left are the same as what you see on the bottom. Okay, the free PDFs on the bottom, but you can see how like there's a bunch of hyperlinks on the screen. There's hyperlinks so you can kind of click on one of these entries and it kind of a table will be kind of embedded there for you to look at. So as opposed to the PDFs, you actually have to go out and find the table elsewhere there. Okay, so but yeah, you kind of have to assume the HB also down there with the PDFs. That's just typically the top of the screen. So just kind of please keep that in mind. You know, you like I said, you can use it either way. I'm just going to use ClassWeb because it's a little easier to kind of talk about that. That's what I use in my classes. But for like searching, for example, obviously with the PDFs, you're just going to have to, you know, understand kind of where you need to go in the grand scheme of things and the schedules, kind of the general topic, and find that PDF, and then you can obviously do like a find within the PDF for specific terms. Okay, so just keeping that in mind. Also, another resource that I want you all to remember is this Library of Congress Classification and Shelf Listing Manual, which is, come on, where's my little, there we go, which are guidelines for establishing Library of Congress classification numbers as well as assigning them to library materials. So it has all sorts of good information there on, you know, in what circumstances, you know, you apply Library of Congress classification numbers, the shelf listing, right, kind of the order that you have resources on the shelf, and so forth. So I do highly recommend, and this is free, by the way. Okay, I have the link here at the bottom. You can just Google Library of Congress Classification and Shelf Listing Manual, I recommend just kind of going through and just looking at the various topics because it would be very helpful. And so I'll be kind of referencing this a few times throughout the webinar. So just as an FYI, that's the CSM is what I'll be talking about. Okay. Okay, so those are our main resources, the actual Library of Congress classification schedules and then the classification and shelf listing manual. Now, let's get into the actual anatomy of an LCC call number. So, like I said, all Library of Congress classification call numbers will begin with at least one uppercase letter that represents the broad subject area. So looking at this call number on the screen where it says, Z665 2012, this Z represents bibliography, library science, information science generally. Okay? But like I said, sometimes there's multiple capital letters that you'll see there. Also, underneath that, we have numbers, or just next to it, right? So, sorry, just one thing. So this is how you typically see the LCC call number on like the spine of a book. But what we're going to be doing is we're going to be constructing LCC call numbers that you would put like in a MARC record, like in the actual catalog record, which is more horizontal as opposed to vertical. Okay, so keeping that in mind is the same, but just oriented slightly differently. The numbers that come next after that initial letter or letters represent the specific topic. In this case, this work, which is the Introduction to Information Science by David Bawden and Lynn Robinson, is just a general work on library and information science specifically. Next is what's called a Cutter or Cutter number that represents the main author's last name. Okay, so in this case, the period B39 represents Bawden, who's listed first. He is what's called the main entry for this work. We'll talk more about this in a moment. So we construct a Cutter that represents his last name so that we can keep resources organized on the shelf by topic, obviously, but then within the topic by what's called main entry. Okay, so like the main author's last name. And then finally, the last part of an LCC call number is the date of publication. If you do have some older works in your collection, sometimes the date of publication is not included. And that's fine, but nowadays it's pretty standard to include that date as well. Okay, so that all the works on this particular topic by this particular author are then organized by publication date. Before we start using ClassWeb or just Library of Congress classification to find these numbers, I want to start at the end of the call number, so typically the publication date, and then move back to the beginning. So that we'll look at the actual LC classification numbers last, but it's important to understand, what's going on with the date as well as the Cutter numbers first, so that you have a better understanding of what you're looking at in the actual LCC schedules. Okay, so let's just start very basics at the end. Okay, so first of all, like I said, the date will typically be the last part of your LCC call number, typically, okay? So, like I said, in most cases, this will generally be the year of publication, okay? I'm going to have a little table here in a minute to show you if you don't have a publication date, what to choose instead. But in some cases, you may also see like a little lowercase letter at the end of that year. That's what's called a work letter. It's used to differentiate between what would otherwise be identical call numbers, okay? So I'm not going to get into that here in this webinar for the sake of time, but just if you look up work letters in that classification and shelf listing manual, you'll see what all they mean, okay? So oftentimes you see them used to differentiate between different editions of the same work, okay, which would may have within the same year, publication year. So as far as what to choose, first of all, for those who know MARC, if you don't, that's totally fine. But within MARC coding, what's in that 264 second indicator of 1 subfield C, if we're talking about RDA cataloging, the 260C if you're using AACR2. That's the date we would use. For those who are not familiar with MARC or RDA or ACR2, just try to find whatever the publication date is, okay? And then get rid of any additional characters that are part of that, like square brackets or question marks or things like that, okay? So if you have the publication date of like 1970 in square brackets, you would just use 1970 is the date in the call number and just leave it at that. Okay, if you have publication date as well as a copyright date, choose the publication date. If you have, like in this case of like 1962 or 1963, you choose the earlier date. And that's the same if you do have any sort of range of dates, okay? So you choose the earlier year of the range, okay? And then if you just have something like, you know, not after June 12th, 1900, it's not very specific, just you have to have something, right? So in this case, you just choose 1900, okay? So to have something there, right? So this is kind of the basic cheat sheet. If you have anything that's more complex, date-wise, then once again, that classification and shelf listing manual is super helpful in this regard. Now, I want to spend a little bit more time on cutters, okay? Because this is kind of, I think, the more complicated of the, between dates and cutters. Cutters is more complicated. So, so here, like I said, that, you know, after the LC classification number, then it starts over in terms of the letter, okay? So we want to, once we get past, like in my examples here, we have Z665. Once we reach like a period and then another uppercase letter, we've moved now beyond the Library of Congress classification number and into cutter territory. So first of all, cutter numbers, or just cutters, are also alphanumeric codes, but they represent words or names that allow for the alphabetical arrangement of books on the shelf. They're named cutters because in honor of the creator of these things, Charles Cutter. Okay, so Charles Cutter was a big name of, you know, in the late 19th, early 20th century in librarianship. He also, you know, created the Objects and Means and was a pretty big name then. So we have these called cutters in honor of him. Okay. Now, they are typically placed after the classification number within the call number, like I said, and they're also very important, right? So you typically, once again, do not see an LCC call number without at least one cutter, okay? At least one cutter typically. And sometimes you'll have two, and that's okay. There's sometimes one, sometimes two, but never more than two. Never more than two. There are three main types of cutters in LCC, and multiple types can be found in one LCC call numbers. Because remember, you can have up to two cutters per call number. So you may have a combination of these types. The one that you'll see most frequently is the main entry cutter. I mentioned last time main entry, for our purposes, if you're not familiar with cataloging, it is generally the main person who's involved in the creation of that work. So like if there's one author of the work, you know, Stephen King, James Patterson, whatever, we just take that last name of the author and create a cutter representing that author, okay? For those who are familiar with MARC cataloging, whatever's in the MARC 1XX field, so like the 100 field, 110, 130, etc., would be our main entry there. So, and if there's not kind of a main author, then we default to title, okay? So we default to title, main entry. So we just cutter the first word of the title typically. Okay, so I'm sorry my examples are kind of cut off here, but there'll be plenty more, I promise. Also, in addition to the main entry, cutters from the LCC schedules or tables themselves. Okay, so, and these will just be different depending on the situation. So I'll obviously have plenty of examples of this in a moment, but these can represent different things, like, you know, a topic, a format, a time period. So for example, we can use, in some places, A2 to represent periodicals on a certain topic, and then what's being cut off here, I think, is like what C5 representing chocolate. Okay, so these cutters from the table will represent different things depending on the context. And then finally, another popular cutter that you'll find are geographic cutters. Oftentimes these are predetermined cutters that represent a specific city, county, region, country, etc. We will probably get into this more next time. I think, yeah, the geographic cutters we'll talk about more next time. But for example, Mexico is M6. So if we do have a resource that focuses on a specific geographic area, it can be helpful to add that geographic cutter if it's allowed. Okay, if it's allowed, because we have to go with what the LCC schedules allow us to do. So, but I really want to focus on the first main type, the main entry, for most of the remainder of this webinar. So just to show you how this kind of comes together with like an actual book, okay? So this book, you see on the left-hand side, How to Play Monopoly for Complete Beginners, okay? So by Robert Ticker, okay? So if I have this book in my hand and I need to create a call number for it, my first step would be, and we'll kind of go through this, like I said, a little bit later on, is look up whatever the LCC class number should be for this. In this case, I'll tell you this is the full call number I created for this book. What I did is I looked up GV1469, an LCC, which represents, in this case, remember it's hierarchical, this system. So it moves from kind of the broader category of recreation and leisure, in this case, through the more specific topics of games and amusements, even more specifically, indoor games and amusements, even more specifically, board games and move games. And here, GV1469 represents just other board games organized by the title. Okay, so that's why, according to to this instruction that I'll see within the LCC schedules, is that the first cutter is recommended within LCC should be representing the particular game, this board game. So M65, representing Monopoly. And sometimes these cutters are actually provided within the LCC schedules, as we'll see, and sometimes we actually have to create them ourselves, okay? But it'll be clear what we need to do once we get to the schedules. Okay, so GV1469 and then period M65 represents all resources on the board game Monopoly, okay, within recreation and leisure. Then, if I want to then organize within this particular topic, I need to then create a cutter for the author, in this case, the last name of Ticker. So T53, representing Ticker. So that way we have, you know, him there amongst the other Monopoly books and then organized by last name. And then I'm just made this up. It was published in 2021. Okay, so it's kind of a breakdown of that call number. Okay, then once again, I'm just writing it horizontally, but on the actual spine of the book, it would be written like vertically. It's fine. So if we want to place this in context with other books on Monopoly, here's one, the Monopoly book that you see that popped up, Strategy and Tactics of the World's Most Popular Game by Maxine Brady. And then another one, How to Play Monopoly and Win by Carrie Butters. How does this work? So if I have my Ticker book here at the end, because alphabetically he comes after Brady and Butters, then I would still have, the same class number in first cutter, right? Because they're both about Monopoly, the board game Monopoly, so that remains the same. But that second cutter representing the last name of these authors would change, as well as the publication date. Yeah. So that's key. So it keeps everything in the order, all these resources on the shelf together by topic, so collocates by topic, and then organized by, like I said, typically the main author on the shelf within that. Okay, so, and, Dewey Decimal works largely in the same way. It's just obviously we don't, obviously there's a slightly different class number, as well as Dewey doesn't really use cutters as frequently as LCC. So LCC is very cutter happy, a lot of cutters. Okay, and this is what I just said. Okay, so what I want us to do is I want us to determine how to create these mythical main entry cutters. How do we do this? So the main way that you can do this is using what's called the LCC cutter number generating table, okay, which I'll have on the next slide. But you can also access it, like I said, from that classification and shelf listing manual. I have a direct link here at the bottom, but it's this G63 for cutter numbers, you'll find it there as well, okay? This allows us to create main entry cutters as well as other types of cutters if we need. Like I said, we'll want to have an initial letter, capital letter at the first, which is the first letter of the author's last name, and then we want to translate, if you will, the next two letters of the name using the cutter table. So let's take a look, shall we? Okay, so this is it. This is our little code book for creating cutters. Here where we have 5 lines, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And the first line is where we would go if we had a name or if we have a title main entry, the first word of the title, after excluding the initial articles, that has an initial vowel. So A-E-I-O-U, right? So a vowel. And then if our name begins with an initial letter S, we start on line 2. If it starts with the initial letters Q-U, we start on line 3. Line 4 is for initial consonants at the beginning. And then line 5 we're just going to set aside for now because that's for expansion. Okay, really for our purposes we want to just start with either lines 1, 2, 3, or 4. Okay, so let's start with just a name, with my name to keep it simple. Okay, for snow. Okay, so if I want to create a cutter for snow, what line should I start on? I'm going to ask the crowd here. What line should I start on? Okay, I'm seeing a bunch of 2s. I'm seeing a bunch of 2s, and I agree. I agree with the 2s because my name starts with S, right? So I want to just focus in on line 2. Very good. It says here for the second letter, use the number and then an arrow, right, pointing at this complex, strange, collection of numbers and letters. Okay, let's work on what this means. So what this is saying is that we need to look at the second letter of my name, in this case N, right? So Snow, S-N-O-W. So I want to find that letter in line 2, kind of over a particular number. Okay, so so you guys are ahead of me. So N is between M and P, which is over the number 6. Okay, so let me kind of move forward here. So first of all, starting on line 2, then I find the second letter of my name, N, which is between M and P, so that's over 6. So far, my cutter is S6. Okay, S6 so far. Okay, everybody still with me? Because I can go back if I've already lost you. Then I want to make sure. Okay. All right. So far I'm getting yeses. Okay. Okay. All right. So, okay. Seeing some typing. Okay. Okay, good. Okay, great. Okay. Typically, main entry cutters, we want to just go beyond that. Okay. You may find some cutters sometimes that are only just that initial letter and then a number, and that's fine. But in many cases, the main entry cutter, we want to go one more place, okay, because that's typically how they're done. So in order to do that, to go beyond that, we need to go to line 5, okay, because note how these for lines 1 through 4, it says for the second letter. It says that for all of them, right, the second letter. We want to go beyond that second letter, so that's why we're going to line 5 now. Going to line 5 for expansion to an additional number. So my last name, S-N-O-W, Dale's already there. Dale's like, bam. That S and O is between that M through O, which is over 6. So yeah, so they got it. So S66 is my cutter. Okay, and whether we have that period at the beginning really depends on the placement of the cutter in the call number. Okay, so for the first cutter should have a period in front of it. The second one should not. Okay, so don't worry about the period for now. I want you all to please cutter your last name here. I'm going to bring up the cutter table again. So I want you to cutter your last name, and please post it in the chat whenever you're ready. Okay, so Yvonne, you have C66. Okay, so Cook. Okay, so yeah, nice. And if you do encounter any issues, like if you're like, oh, I don't know what to do, then just say so. Okay. Okay, so Lena, you're having some issue with Phelps. Ooh, okay, good. I kind of figured that there might be some issues. I was hoping, actually, that there would be some issues here so we could talk. Because there are going to be plenty of instances where, you know, your name may not fit, right? You can see here by looking at each of the line that it doesn't have every single letter, right? Okay. Okay, so let's talk. Okay, so Lena, you've run across this a lot. Let's talk. Let's talk about Phelps. Okay, so let's cutter Lena's last name, Phelps. All right, let's do this together. Let's do this together. So what do you all think? So what line should we start with for Phelps? P-H-E-L-P-S. Okay, so yeah, P is an initial consonant, so we start on line 4. Perfect. That's our first step. So we definitely want to start our cutter with P. We know that. But then H is not there. Yikes. What do we do? What would your guess be if you had to guess? Okay, so Yvonne, you're thinking 5, perhaps? Okay, go to the next letter. Yeah. Okay, skip to just skip it. Oh, these are all good answers. Okay, so the general rule of thumb, if your letter is not represented on the line you're on, you still want to stick with that line. So I want to stick with line 4. Okay, we don't want to move on to line 5. The general rule of thumb is to choose the letter that's closest to the letter you need. So H is closest to I. Okay, so in this case, I personally, if I were creating a cutter for Phelps, I would have P5. Now, different places will have different policies where sometimes it may say, you know, round down. Okay, regardless, just round down. So you could legitimately also have P4 for Phelps. Ultimately, what your answer should be, what the cutter should be, depends on your library's shelf list. Okay, so your collection. You want to make sure that your collection stays in order alphabetically on the shelf. Okay, so whatever you need to do to make that happen, you do that. Okay, so so if you need to, this is kind of an art. That's why it's called an art, not a science, is that you kind of use the cutter table as like kind of a guide, but then, you know, just kind of there's some wiggle room, there's some flexibility here in case you need to kind of adjust things to make sure things fit on the shelf. Okay, so I'm just going to stick with P5 because, like I said, the H is closer to I. So P5 and then PHE is next. So then we go to line 5, and then we definitely have 4 there. So I'm going to put P54 yeah, Lena, exactly. So it really either P54 or P44 would be a correct answer as far as I'm concerned. But like I said, it depends. If you already have a Phelps at P54, okay, so you already have, let's just say, you know, Karen Phelps has written a book on the same topic where you would have the same cutter, then you need to adjust. Okay, so in that case, you know, maybe Karen Phelps is P44 and Lena Phelps is P54, right? Okay, so just adjust accordingly. Okay, this is great. So does that make sense, everyone? Let's see. I'm trying to see if anyone else had a issue. Yeah, I'm not seeing anyone with it because everyone else, you feel like you got your cutter okay, right? So yeah. So like I said, you just have to be kind of like use your judgment, use your cataloger's judgment in determining what to put. Yeah. Okay. Awesome. So this is just, and feel free to keep typing questions. Yeah, Ian, exactly. Room for creativity. Who would have thunk? Right? In cataloging, there's room for creativity here, but not too much, right? Don't go too far, right? Because you got to make sure your collection is not too wacky in terms of in the alphabet. So yeah, and so here's just my some guidelines here on the screen. Oh, so Lori, so the Falk. So yeah, so your last name, right? So it starts with F, which is a consonant. So we start on line 4, and so FA. So I have on line 4 F3, right? So FA, so A is over 3. So in my estimation, yours would be F3, and then L. So on line 5, L is 5, right? So actually it's F35 is what I have. Does that make sense? That, yeah. Okay. Yeah. Good. But like I said, we just talked about, that some names are just not going to cutter precisely according to the table. So just use your judgment, okay? Use your judgment. It's just like what I just said. Also, some other guidelines is that you do want to ignore any like punctuation marks or spaces if they exist in a name or title, and then just cutter abbreviations as they appear. Okay, so if we have, D'Ambrosio, just ignore that, apostrophe and just cutter out, the DAM. Same thing with like St. Valentine. Okay, so just cutter out, ignoring punctuation, and just cutter those abbreviations as they appear generally. So, yeah, sorry, Dale. Sorry to mess with you, but, there you go. But it's good in the sense because, once again, your goal is to keep everything in order on the shelf. So that's good. I don't know. But yeah, I wish the cutter table was a bit more fleshed out. I agree. Also, if you have to cutter a title, which does happen, right? If you do have a title main entry, which happens with like edited works all the time, then you just ignore that initial article if there is one and just start cuttering, after that initial article, the first word of the title, in this case, like panda. Also, you can, like I said, ignore initial articles in English, right? So if you do have like, Spanish language collection or any other language, just if you might want to get familiar with those initial articles because you don't want to skip them unless that initial article is actually part of a person's name or place name, like in the case of like Los Angeles, then, don't skip that, but otherwise we can. Okay. Also, if you have a situation where a name is less than 3 letters long, then just cut her out as far as you can. So if we have like R-O, so Rowe is a last name, obviously we don't have any more letters, so we just catalog Rowe and be content with it. And then if we need further specificity, then you can, for names at least, you have the first name that you can cutter. So if we have, like Karen Rowe and, Lena Rowe and Ian Rowe, then we can start cuttering into the first names of the author to make that cutter unique. Because that's other than keeping things in order on the shelf, your other goal is to make that cutter unique to a particular author, okay, so that we have unique call numbers, okay? For LCC, that is a goal, is to create a unique call number, okay, because it's a location device, right, shelf location device. Okay, now the cheat, the cheat website. I didn't want to bring this up until after I got you comfortable-ish with the cutter table. Yeah, so Susie, you know what I'm talking about. So, but we do have the cataloging calculator, the beautiful, lovely, wonderful, wonderful cataloging calculator, which is free. It's at the calculate at .alptown.com, but you can just Google this as well, the cataloging calculator, that you just type in the name that you want cutter, making sure you choose this LC cutter search option. I know that he's actually expanded out options here. It's a really awesome website. But I just typed in snow here, and then magic. It produces the full, in this case, the full cutter. I don't need, obviously, all of these. I just need the S66. And yeah, Susie, it does save your brain, but do we know if Kyle is going to keep this running for all time? We don't know that. We love Kyle, but he may not be around forever. This website may not be around forever. So it's good to at least have a basic knowledge of the catalog, the cutter table, just in case, right? Just in case this website goes down, it doesn't exist anymore, and and so forth. So, and Kristen, okay, so would you keep the S66 and not round up? Exactly. So here I just cutted out my entire name, and I would just lop off that 9. I wouldn't keep the 9. I would just stick with the S66. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So which is typical for cutters, using just two digits. Yeah. Okay. But keep in mind also is that for those who also may work a little bit with Dewey, I don't know if anyone here also works with Dewey Decimal Classification. What we're talking about here with these cutters are specific to Library of Congress classification, okay? So if you do see like Dewey Decimal call numbers, the cutter that you see, if it is, assuming it even uses a cutter, because sometimes you don't see that, it uses actually a different cuttering system. Believe it or not, there's multiple cutter tables. There's like the cutter like 4-figure table, there's the cutter Sanborn table, etc. So just keep that in mind, that sometimes the cutters will look a little bit different depending on which cutter table you use. Yeah, Janice, sorry to to burst your bubble here, but yeah, of course we have to make things a lot more complicated because we're in cataloging. That's what we do. That's our goal, is to try to make things as complicated as possible. So anywho, so just keep that in mind. This, I think, as Susie was saying, this is definitely the quickest option here, but sometimes it's helpful just to have the table as well. Okay. So any further questions about cuttering? Are we do we feel fairly comfortable-ish with constructing main entry cutters? Do I need to go back and talk further? Like, there's all sorts of stuff also, like I said, in the classification shelf listing manual that that you can find on cuttering as well. So, okay. Okay, good. Now, okay, so let's take this newfound knowledge and look at some, the actual LCC classification schedules. So like I said, for my examples, I'm using Classification Web, but just try to kind of translate what you're seeing here into just kind of a more, like, less, functional, the PDF view. But here, this is, classweb.org if you want to check it out. I just click on main menu, but if you want to sign up for a free trial, you click on this other, sign up for an account if you want to give it a try. And this is the main menu for ClassWeb. As you can see here, not only do we have the LC classification schedules, which is the first one, right? This is if we want to search and browse the LC classification schedules, but this ClassWeb also has Library of Congress subject headings, the LC genre form terms list, demographic group terms, children's headings, all sorts of good stuff. All of those sorts of good stuff in ClassWeb. So it's a really fantastic resource. But here, what you do is you just click on like search or browse, and that prompts you for the username and password. And then, like I said, if you are just using the classification PDFs files, this is what that page looks like, the main page for that, where you, once again, you kind of have to know the general area you need to be in. If we need, be in the Bs, right, for philosophy and psychology, etc. It has like an outline, as well as kind of the more in-depth text for each of these, okay? And you just kind of click on whatever link you need here. Then for the actual, searching within ClassWeb, which is going to be obviously a little different than the PDFs, we have options for searching by class number, caption, keyword, or index, or both of those. So the caption is actually the term you see next to the classification number in the schedules. Okay, that's the most specific portion of the hierarchy. So for example here, a TX818 that's about like making sandwiches. Okay, so sandwiches, it doesn't provide all the context, but that, you know, sandwiches is what's kind of associated with this TX818. The index terms are just the kind of cross-references, so that's the kind of the variant terms, if you will. So, for example, you know, if you search for boot industry, the actual caption should be footwear, period, shoes. So, index, you know, searching by index term can be kind of helpful in kind of looking at, you know, the different cross-references as well. And then keyword just searches everywhere. So, so I do recommend to my students, at least, that you try different search strategies. If one is not working, then just try different ones to find what you're looking for. And then, like I said, for the PDFs, obviously it's going to be a little bit different. Okay. Now, within the actual schedule text, this is kind of a typical look to this, what we would see. A few things to point out are the breadcrumbs, which are really handy in classification web that tell you exactly kind of where you are. Because, like I said, those caption terms are just the most specific part of that hierarchy. It may not provide the entire context. So here we're within home economics, and then cooking, specifically baking and confectionery, and then within baking cakes. Okay, so breadcrumbs, you know, that's kind of not the official term. That's the term that I use to kind of like Hansel and Gretel, helping you find your way through this classification schedules. Okay. Also, within ClassWeb, you'll see this kind of blue ribbon that highlights kind of where you search, right? So if you had searched for TX771 for general works on cakes, baking cakes, then it just kind of highlights it, and that's really the only reason for it. It just kind of highlights where you searched, what you searched. Okay, a few more things. I know that we're running out of time here, but it's just a few more like little options here. And that, like I said, this is for the most part within the PDFs as well. But you can see once again those captions on the right-hand side and the number associated with those on the left. But note how each of these entries, they're indented. A lot of them are indented. That shows the hierarchy. So here under cakes, including cupcakes, we have general works on baking cakes, as well as cake decorating, cake pops. All of those are more specific topics underneath cakes. Then we go back out again, right? So cookies, we go back out. We don't have that indentation. That's another kind of more general topic, et cetera, et cetera. So you want to really pay close attention to that hierarchy so you know what fits where, like, right? So that this is a general work on baking cakes as opposed to a general work on confectionery. So here, this is what I was talking about, because general works you're going to find all over the place within LCC. Okay, so you have to kind of make sure you see what it's under to know kind of the meaning, provide that context. Also, you're going to see these ways of directing you to other classification numbers if needed. And once again, this is also in the PDFs. So if, for example, you have a work on cheesecake, baking cheesecake, it says you don't just use this cakes section, you actually need to go not very far, actually to TX773 for this dessert, pies, and puddings, including cheesecake. Another thing that you'll see throughout is this CF business, so CF, in this case, TX657, etc. This is Latin abbreviation for confere. It means literally to bring together, but in English it means compare. So this is a way of LC telling you, well, you're here at Baker's Confectioner's Supplies, but if you do have a work on baking pans, consider using this one instead, this TX657.B34 instead. Okay, so you want to pay close attention to those in case there's another place in the schedules that would be more appropriate, for a particular topic. Then this is when I'm going to skip ahead for those because those of you who don't have ClassWeb. So also I want to point out in the kind of the last little bit of time, the 1 minute I have left, is that note how in some of these places in the LCC schedules, this is also in the PDFs, is that we have additional cutters that represent a particular topic. Okay, so these are not the main entry cutters. So in the case of like TX767.C5, the C5 in this context represents chocolate. Okay, same thing with all like the breads, right? We have like B35 for bagels and B55 for biscuits and scones and so forth. Okay, so in this case, we would want to include not only the class number, obviously, so TX767 or 770, but also that first cutter representing, the specific, in this case, food product, okay, or bread, etc. And then we would put the main entry cutter immediately after, right? So to build our call number. So what I have on the next slide is just, like a practice activity, but don't worry about that. It was just kind of to kind of understand what you're looking at, but I'm going to skip ahead for just a second. So that's just the basics. Like I said, laying the foundation. I would love to see you all back at the end of August, so Tuesday, August 31st, to continue our journey through Library of Congress classification. That's at 11 Eastern. We're going to talk about, now that we understand how to find LC classification numbers and cutters, how we build a full LCC call number, how to find geographic cutters, as well as basic use of tables in LCC. Okay, so sorry, this ran a little bit long. We had a great cutter conversation, so sorry about that. Any questions about what we've talked about? Okay, good. I already have some registrants. Yay! Anything you want to talk about? I know we're kind of at time here, but okay. But if you do have anything that you're just really want to talk about, please email me. I really don't mind. I'd love to hear from you. And otherwise, I will see you all in a little over a month. Okay. And like I said, you're getting these slides. So they'll send you the slides. Okay. Thank you, Deb.
Yes. Participants will be getting the slides in the survey. Thank you, Karen, for such an informative webinar this morning. As always, we encourage you to keep an eye on the Swiftland CE calendar, the Swiftland Facebook page, or your message from the listserv. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you, Deb.
Thank you,
Karen.
Taylor. Take care, guys.